Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Bernard Nickel. As chair of the philosophy department, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to these, the 58th Whitehead Lectures in Philosophy. As a preliminary remark, as you know, access to the yard is restricted right now to Harvard ID card holders. However, there is a reception after this talk, which will take place right afterwards, so around 5 or so. And in order to allow everybody to attend that reception, we've coordinated with the facilities department to allow everybody who's here today to come to Emerson Hall, which is the home of the philosophy department. But if you do not have a Harvard ID with you, or if you do not have a Harvard ID at all, there's a sign-up sheet that Kate will be passing around. Please sign up if you want to join us in Emerson Hall. Do you want to just start at the beginning and then? Great. And there'll also be another opportunity to sign up at the end of the talk, between the talk and the Q&A. So if you don't get around to it, not a big thing. I think we'll take the sign-up sheet around 4:15, and then we'll have a big group of people and we'll escort you to Emerson Hall for the reception. Okay. With that, let me introduce the lectures. These lectures are named after one of the several great philosophers who called our department home during the first half of the 20th century. Alfred North Whitehead retired from the Department of Philosophy here in 1937, having arrived from Imperial College, London, 13 years before. Whitehead's influence on the students of our department was important, even if he was, as his obituary in the Harvard Crimson from 1948 states, for the majority of Harvard students, no more than a name uttered reverently in the comparative sanctity of seminar or professorial conference. Whitehead's most notable influence was on our own W.V.O. Quine, whose supervisor he was during the 2 years it took Quine to complete his PhD. But he was also, of course, a great mentor to Bertrand Russell earlier in his career at Trinity College, Cambridge, and the two worked together for a decade to complete the famous Principia Mathematica, on which Quine's dissertation was based. Principia is probably his best known work. His best known doctrine is probably his metaphysical view, centered around process philosophy. It is a daunting view, hard to interpret, and I wouldn't be surprised if its relative inaccessibility contributed significantly to that reverent uttering of his name that the Crimson obit mentioned. And yet Whitehead was a man of parts. In addition to these extraordinarily abstract views in mathematics and in metaphysics, he also had a long and abiding interest in the philosophy of education. I was struck, for instance, by these remarks from an essay entitled Technical Education and its Relation to Science and Literature. No course of study can claim any position of ideal completeness. The insistence in the Platonic culture on disinterested intellectual appreciation is a psychological error. Action and our implication in the transition of events amid the inevitable bond of cause to effect are fundamental. An education which strives to divorce intellectual or aesthetic life from these fundamental facts carries with it the decadence of civilization. The Alfred North Whitehead Lectures began in 1957 and have continued with some lapses during the 70s and 80s pretty much annually since then. The lectures have been given by such distinguished philosophers as Gilbert Ryle, P.F. Strawson, Alan Gibbard, Barbara Herman, Dorothy Edgington, Bob Stalnaker, and Amy Thomason. While the lectures are named after Whitehead, they were established through the generosity of Edwin de Turck Bechtel, Bechtel of the Harvard College class of 1905 was a great benefactor of the department who loved philosophy, but was grateful for the advice he received from William James not to make a career in it. He wound up doing something far more lucrative. The Whitehead Endowment reflects the esteem Mr. Bechtel had for Whitehead, whom he came to know after Whitehead joined the Harvard faculty in the 1920s. In his gift, Mr. Bechtel stipulated that the Whitehead lecturer be a distinguished scholar or other qualified person who would give a lecture on a philosophical subject. And with that, let me cede the floor to my colleague Dick Moran to introduce our speaker, Mirandra Fricker, who is both a distinguished scholar and a qualified person. Thank you.
Welcome to all of you. It's good to see you all here. Thanks for coming. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mirandra Fricker to you today. Mirandra is currently the Julius Silver Professor of Philosophy at NYU. She received her DPhil at Oxford in 1996 under the direction of Bernard Williams and Sabina Lovabond. She then later taught at Birkbeck College, University College London, where she was head of department for a time. She taught at University Sheffield, and then moved stateside to teach for several years at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, where she was a distinguished professor. She's recently moved to downtown to NYU. She's recently, 2002, the president of the American Philosophical Association. She is a fellow of the British Academy as of 2006, and was also quite recently elected as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, just kind of down the street from here. That was in 2020. So she has ranged widely in philosophy. She's the author of many publications in ethics, moral psychology, particularly on conditions of responsibility, blame, and forgiveness, as well as in, of course, feminism and social epistemology. In the year 2000, she co-edited and contributed to the Cambridge Companion to Feminism in Philosophy, a book that she put together with Jennifer Hornsby and is a landmark collection of philosophers working in feminism. Then, a few years later, 2007, is the book that made her famous. From Oxford Press, Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing, which has since been translated into Swedish, Spanish, Japanese, Chinese, Portuguese, Turkish, German, Korean, and French. This is a special book, and despite what our deans routinely ask us to say whenever we make a case statement for a senior appointment or for a tenure decision, in philosophy, there are really very few books that can truthfully be said to have changed the field or to have inaugurated new fields of study. Epistemic Injustice, however, is one such book. It did not just give a name to a set of topics whose time had come, but which had not yet reached philosophical self-consciousness, although that would be accomplishment enough. It did so in an extremely wide-ranging and creative way, reorienting ethics and epistemology with respect to each other, showing how much there is for them to learn from each other. And one reason for the great influence of this book is that, contrary to some other trailblazers, Fricker develops this reorientation in a decidedly non-dogmatic way, drawing on a rich variety of philosophical and other sources, reaching out to political and intellectual constituencies that often operate in isolation from each other. It's a book that's concerned to open up projects in philosophy more than to have the last word or to shut down rival ways of understanding it. And that, I am sure, is part of its long life and the valuable part that it still plays in current debates almost 20 years later. Epistemic Injustice is a book of philosophy, of course, but the book is also part of a feminist practice of philosophy, drawing on a lifetime of political involvement so that the discussion seamlessly integrates the theoretical and the practical. And in doing so, it also brings together the social dimension and the personal dimension of our epistemic practices as knowers and as attributors of knowledge to others. It brings together the institutional dimension as well as the dimension of emotions and the relevant reactive attitudes. And it brings together a discussion of institutional vices and institutional virtues, along with the idea of group testimony, moral relativism, knowledge and the social category of being a knower, knowledge and the value and the point of knowledge in a variety of contexts. And in the nearly 20 years since the publication of Epistemic Justice, it has only grown in influence. Nor has Professor Fricker been idle or repetitive in the meantime. She is, as always, a very active public citizen in the intellectual community. She has published 2 further collections, edited collections, The Epistemic Life of Groups, Essays in the Epistemology of Collectives, and in 2019, the Routledge Handbook of Social Epistemology. What she's working on now, and we'll be hearing a little bit about over the next couple of days, is a book on the legacy of Bernard Williams. She also has, I believe, a book forthcoming on bringing together her recent work on responsibility, blame, and forgiveness. And we're all looking forward very much to both of these projects. For now, I just want to introduce the first of 2 lectures from her project on Bernard Williams under the general heading, Bernard Williams' Historical Self-Consciousness. Today's lecture is called A Project of Impure Inquiry, Descartes and Wittgenstein. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mirandra Fricker.
How wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the very generous introduction. I'm most honored and most touched, and fabulous to see so many people here. Thanks already to the wonderful grad students who took me to lunch. I'm really enjoying my visit. So I'm, as Dick said, yes, I'm giving these 2 lectures. I'm hoping they'll be part of a book project that's sort of growing on Bernard Williams. And he's a conundrum in so many ways and difficult, I think, to write about. So I thought about it a long time, and I've hit on a sort of way of thinking about him, which these lectures express. So maybe I'll be able to tell from your reactions whether this is a good idea or a lousy idea. But Williams used to emphasize all the time the importance of thinking in a historical way in life, but in philosophy in particular, philosophy's relationship to actual history and philosophy's relationship to the history of itself. And so I started thinking about, this is going to sound a little crazy, but my kids used to have a toy when they were small. I bet there's a name for it. And I did try to find the name for it before these lectures, but I still don't know what it's called. It's basically a grid of little plastic sticks. And if you put it on your face, the miracle is that then you have an imprint of your face when you take it off. There's obviously got to be a name for one of these things. And I was thinking, well, maybe I'll read Williams by way of the imprint left on his work by other figures who were influential. And so today I'll be looking at the imprint left on Williams by Descartes and Wittgenstein, and then tomorrow the imprint left on Williams by Hume and Nietzsche. And perhaps in that way we get a nice as it were, perhaps negative, I suppose, technically speaking, but telling portrayal of how he related to some of these key other philosophers that influenced him, either very directly and explicitly, or in the case of Wittgenstein in particular, and to some extent Hume less explicitly. And so that we come to know Williams in his own historical self-consciousness as a philosopher. So that's the project. And I've given you your handout of rather a lot of quotations. I'm going to read my lecture, and so I hope you're sitting comfortably and that it will be sufficiently lively. And I was thinking we need a little interaction. So you have a handout you can interact with. And so when I read the quotations, please feel free to follow them. It's all in the words, isn't it, somehow? I feel like increasingly as I get older, I'm feeling like philosophy is all in the words, and that speaking philosophy is rather different from producing a philosophical text. And I'm looking at Williams partly in light of what his philosophical texts are like, because he's so darn difficult to interpret, and part of it is because of what his texts were like. So I'll begin with some reflections about style. But the first quotation on the handout is really just a little epigraph for today, because part of the relationship that philosophy has with history, or ought to have in his view with history, invites a way of doing philosophy that is not pure, but impure, because it involves itself in history, as he often used to like saying. And so this first one is about that. The fate of the theoretical issue of objectivity reminds us in one way of the impurity of philosophy. If it is to have anything to say about that question, it will have to address a lot more than philosophy. So let me move first to issues of style. Bernard Williams wrote perhaps more than any other philosopher in the broadly analytic tradition about the importance of history, and particularly the importance of the history of philosophy to the activity of philosophical reflection in the now. It's hard to credit that just over 2 decades have elapsed since his death. So present and vivacious remains his philosophical voice in our philosophical conversations. It's poignant that we must now reluctantly begin to think of his work as part of the fabric of the history of our discipline. Doing so is, I find, far from straightforward, not least because there are a number of special challenges in doing exegetical work on Williams that stem from his deceptively conversational style of writing, and his avoidance of those isms that might have emboldened one to fix him in this or that philosophical mold. Of course, that was precisely why he avoided them, as he preferred to proceed in a more piecemeal and suggestive fashion. I suspect this is one of the features of his style that means his work will endure, outliving this or that voguish taxonomy of positions. Aside from these features of his style, another of the difficulties in starting to think of Williams' work as part of the history of our subject is simply a matter of personal philosophical history. I knew him as a teacher, as I had the good fortune of having Williams as one of my supervisors for my doctoral thesis. Although one can engage perfectly well in exegesis of the work of a living philosopher, as we often do, still, in cases where the philosopher whose work one hopes to interpret was relatively recently such a central and lively contributor to the conversation, it can feel like it's forever too soon to be taking up the focused exegetical stance. One may, for this reason, resist for a while, uneasy with the prospect of actively pressing them into the past, as if in fear of prematurely stilling an animated body of thought. The impulse to avoid active participation in any such process of intellectual stilling is particularly acute in relation to a philosopher like Williams, whose thinking and conversation and writing was somehow essentially animated, agile, funny, erudite, candid, rather free with delicious anecdote or ironical comment. Williams' skeptical and sometimes satirical mood when it came to certain schools of thought in moral philosophy is not a superficial feature of his philosophical style, for it speaks of a Voltairean instinct to puncture that which struck him as misguided because overblown, or moralistic, or phony, or academic in the pejorative sense of detached from the lively reality of human culture. This spirited sense of the human personality of different schools of thought in moral philosophy, and an occasionally mischievous stroke of the caricaturist's pen when it came to representing them on the page, was a quintessential feature of his philosophical style, whether he was portraying the moral purism of the Kantian morality system, the petty moral accountancy of act utilitarianism, or the government house forms of rule utilitarianism, whose moral colonialism he found deluded. If this spirited skepticism was a characteristic of his philosophical style, we might ask, how did it square with the attitudinally neutral style of modern analytic philosophy and its penchant for certain kinds of purity? Williams' views about the analytical style are instructive. He found that it had a number of important virtues. First, a carefulness regarding matters of accuracy, an epistemic virtue which he was later to cast in Truth and Truthfulness as one of the two cardinal virtues of truth. Second, a sound aspiration to conceptual clarity. Third, a penchant for somewhat plain prose, though in this connection he also noted the tendency for excessive technicality, along with an occasional self-congratulatory narrowness about what philosophical clarity can involve. In his essay, What Might Philosophy Become?, Williams takes up this last critical point and expands upon it throughout, describing the main purpose of the paper by declaring, "What I want to call in question is the idea that there's a style which defines fairly clearly and uniformly across the range of philosophy what counts as clarity and precision and getting it right, and that this style has been defined by the typical procedures of analytic philosophy," unquote. He found this particular one-size-fits-all assumption, moreover, to manifest a scientism that he abhorred. He called this the scientism of style, a species of purism he characterized particularly in relation to the idea that form of a philosophical text makes no contribution to its philosophical content. Finding this to be quite false, he entreated us to consider the writings of key figures in the broadly analytic tradition and ask ourselves whether they can reasonably be read as putting forward content wholly independently from features of their style. He put the point as a rhetorical question. He said, when we turn in particular to moral and political philosophy, and we look at the canon of past philosophy that even analytic philosophy agrees on, does it really look like this? Plato, Hobbes, Hume, Rousseau, indeed John Stuart Mill, not to go into more disputed territory. Do we really suppose that their contributions to the subject are independent of the imaginative and expressive powers of their work? Well, in contrast, Williams argued, what's needed in philosophy is not merely a focus on whether or not the content is accurate and true, but whether it rings true. And this question calls upon style in the sense described, of employing techniques of persuasive power and imagination to constitute the philosophical vision as a compelling one. In order to ring true and convince the reader of its argumentative force, a philosophical text may, quite properly and ordinarily, appeal to metaphors, thought experiments, and other fictional scenarios as a proper part of its arguments for the picture it aims to imprint on its reader's mind. This is actually, if we're really honest about it, the normal mode of analytic philosophy, whose canonical text might involve, in epistemology, for instance, the captivating figure of the Cartesian evil demon, or the brain in a vat scenarios dreamed up by Harman or Putnam, or in moral philosophy, for instance, the many and fabulous trolley problem scenarios conjured up by Foote or Cam and others. We might reflect, too, on the power simply of metaphor, for instance, in Rorty's attempt to smash the idea of philosophy as a mirror of nature. Thoroughly fictional scenario of the state of nature is another literary philosophical conceit that involves the reader's imagination in explicit and some inexplicit ways. And this particular example reminds us, if I may digress for a moment, that part of analytic philosophy's denial about its own uses of socially loaded metaphors and other imaginative mechanisms long had the effect of actively obscuring the sometimes crudely gendered nature of those imaginary tropes, to name just one dimension of imaginative exclusion. I vividly remember when I was a graduate student in the early 90s hearing Michel Lederf talk about Hobbes' state of nature and how the philosophical imaginary he employed seemed to picture people, all apparently ready-made adult white men, sprouting spontaneously like mushrooms from the ground overnight, so that women who in any halfway realistic imagination would have given birth to them and nurtured them to sustain their lives, at least for a while, were not imagined as co-populating the state of nature at all, but at best implicitly imagined as part of its natural resources. Williams, I believe, understood these subterfuges, or he was ready to. One might characterize them as tricks of the purist fantasy that philosophical works are not really texts. Their argumentative structures being imagined as free-floating from all that being a text implies, such as the socially and historically situated author, an imagined reader with certain specific social characteristics, and then some real readers too, who may or may not resemble the imagined one. In What Might Philosophy Become?, Williams gave a brief but stout defense of feminist philosophy against Mary Warnock's comments in her preface to her 96 edited collection entitled Women Philosophers, where she echoed a standard analytic philosophical trope of the time, one I was very familiar with, asserting the alleged impossibility of feminist philosophy. It was just impossible. In a nutshell, she wrote that philosophy as such addressed human universals, and feminism as such did not. Ergo, there can be no feminist philosophy. Now, Williams wrote of this entrenched and, to my mind, self-deceiving piece of purism. There's a rather rapid reply to this argument in more or less its own terms, that among the things which are humanly universal are the sorts of practices and attitudes that are the concern of feminist philosophy. Right. Thanks, Bernard. So, Williams practiced what he preached when it came to the literary form of our philosophical writing, sometimes contributing to its intellectual message. A moment's reflection quickly provides examples in his work. His use of the state of nature in Truth and Truthfulness, which I'll be talking about next time a lot. His invocation of the fictional Gauguin's moral luck, his dilemmas of moral integrity, where a protagonist might be a botanist on an expedition or a research scientist facing an impossible choice. I've been suggesting that this mingling of form and content, this interweaving of argumentative structure and imaginative attitudinal color in his writing, constitutes a first important dimension of impurity in his philosophy, which he self-consciously embraced, as opposed to doing it while pretending to some fantasized pure persuasion of reasons. But let's now ask what, if anything, we might find in Williams' style that's especially pertinent to his lasting fascination, specifically with the borderlands of philosophy and history. In order to explore this question, let's take as our starting point his conception of the history of philosophy. His conception, that is, of the very fabric into which his own writing must now be gradually woven. Doing so will not only lead us to the borderlands we wish to explore, it'll also enable us to ground our exploration firmly in Williams' own conception of the subject. In the preface to his 1978 book, Descartes, The Project of Pure Enquiry, which of course my own title is alluding to, Williams contrasted the history of ideas with the history of philosophy. The first sort of endeavor focuses on the work considered in its own historical context and aims to reconstruct, albeit inevitably through a veil of textual indeterminacies, what it meant at the time. For this sort of enterprise, the central interpretive question is, what did it mean then? He describes such a project as proceeding horizontally through time, being first and foremost one of historical inquiry, so that the genre of the resulting study is, as he puts it, unequivocally history. Naturally, the history of philosophy also focuses on the work itself, and again considers its significance to be underdetermined by its own time, but recognizes in this an opportunity to creatively uncover what the work can mean to us in the present. For this sort of enterprise, the central interpretive question is, what does it mean now? Williams' study of Descartes' philosophy firmly self-identified as taking this latter approach, and he described his project as preferring, quotes, the direction of rational reconstruction of Descartes' thought. In this, he was a modernist, not only as a matter of scholarly focus, but also on account of the fact that his approach to Descartes' text exemplified the energetic modernist spirit of historically self-conscious creativity in the now. I hope that his embrace of this robust modernist attitude may transfer to us a certain aesthetic permission to rationally reconstruct Williams' work in similar spirit, and to use the historical self-consciousness that it bequeaths us as a way of augmenting our own sense of the past as one that is coming to contain Williams' philosophy. We've seen that Williams' conception of the history of philosophy was as a rational reconstruction that contributes to a conversation in the present, free-spirited, but disciplined by the obligation to remain carefully accurate regarding the facts of the historical work. In this conception, we may recognize a two-tier structure, one of basic and epistemically plain facts in the first tier, the text, as it were, overlaid by intrinsically contestable interpretive activity in the second. This two-tier model of interpretation was a constant in Williams' philosophical imagination. Having put it forward in the Descartes book as his conception of what he was doing with Descartes' texts, it received its last and fullest expression in his final monograph, Truth and Truthfulness, no longer specifically in relation to the history of philosophy, but rather in relation to the discipline of history quite generally. There, the two-tier structure is how he pictured the whole enterprise of truthful historical interpretation and explanation. He argued that history must rely on a chronicle, his word, a chronicle of events. That is, a series of events ordered in time, but without causal relations or explanatory structure of any other kind. One might speculate that many of the items in such a chronicle would be what he had earlier introduced as plain truths, facts which are epistemically plain, not in the sense of necessarily being simple or immediately perceptible facts, but in the sense of being evidentially plain in the context. At any rate, on Williams' conception, history proceeds with a series of agreed event facts in chronological order, but then the interpretive business, our second tier, of history gets started, positing causal and explanatory priorities and orderings, thereby already catapulting us into the realm not of truth, for there can be no single historical truth, on Williams' view, but rather of truthfulness. As he expressed the point, and this is the third quotation for you, there's no such thing as the truth about the historical past, though as with the universe or Caesar, there are many truths about it. This means that while we must demand that interpretations of the past should tell us the truth, in the sense that they should not lie or mislead, what we need from them is not to tell us something called the truth about the past. We need them to be truthful and to make sense of the past to us. In this way, Williams' conception of history of philosophy now shows up as all of a piece with his conception of history quite generally. They have in common a two-tier structure, the first tier of plain truths constituting the chronicle, or alternatively the philosophical text to be interpreted, and a second tier at which some plurality of truthful and essentially contestable interpretations is generated. This two-tier structure, which gives a certain constrained creative license to the interpretive imagination, doesn't find explicit presentation in Williams' work until Truth and Truthfulness, but it was implicit in his general conception of the history of philosophy from the start. And this is one of the things I find again and again about Williams' work, is that so much of it is contained in a nice, intense chunk, that a lot of it functions like a sort of prism. You can read any bit of it if you know the rest of his work, and read it a bit like a poem, that you're looking forwards and backwards through all the different things that it resonates with. When it comes to philosophical interpretation, as with historical interpretation in general, there is no one true story, a pluralistic commitment that we might seem to consider to be another kind of philosophical impurity that Williams explicitly championed. In this spirit, I propose to read him, to rationally reconstruct him, if you will, in relation to two very different philosophers, Descartes and Wittgenstein. I found this a surprisingly fruitful combination for accessing some of Williams' deepest motivating commitments, and ultimately his conception of what philosophy needs to be. My hope is that by retracing the ways in which these two historical figures shaped Williams' thought, some previously hidden contours of his own historical self-consciousness as a philosopher will show themselves to us. A little sip of water. So our next section is on Descartes. Descartes and Williams' absolute conception. In a late essay, Williams said, "Unself-conscious modernism is a contradiction in terms." I've so far suggested that Williams, a classicist by first training and an ancient scholar whose philosophical understanding of the Homeric imagination was second to none, presented as a modernist in at least three ways. One was his literarily self-conscious attitude to producing a philosophical text, the insistence that if philosophy was to ring true to its readers, it had better make more honest use of the fact that form can contribute to content. Another was his self-consciously bold, rationally reconstructive stance regarding the practice of history of philosophy. And the third, now using modernist in the more simply historical sense, was that he'd written a scholarly book about a philosopher of the early modern period. This last was mentioned only in passing, so let me now take up this aspect of his modernism and ask, what did Williams take from Descartes' project of pure inquiry that shaped his own thinking? The first thing I'd like to mention about the Descartes book, but we'll quickly set aside, is that in it, Williams explores the hardly Cartesian idea that the concept of knowledge naturally arises in a very basic human social situation of needing to gain information from others. Who can tell me whether P? Williams himself did not further elaborate this idea until the final stage of his career, some years after Edward Craig had produced his immaculate 1990 monograph, Knowledge and the State of Nature, which offered a practical explication of the concept of knowledge using, as Craig makes clear, the same starting conception. A decade or so after that, when Williams was writing Truth and Truthfulness, it was Craig's epistemic state of nature that he used to ground that project. The point I wish to bring out here is simply that the seed thought for Williams' Truth and Truthfulness was already sown in the Descartes book. And this presents us with a salient example, what I mentioned just now, what a surprisingly synchronous thinker Williams was, in that the arc of his whole philosophy over time can seem to be already contained prism-like in any suitably chunky moment of it. Indeed, as you read it, another paper I wrote about Williams a while ago, I came to the conclusion he basically didn't change his mind about anything, maybe one tiny tweak in the way he formulated his relativism view or something like that. But it was as if he had a sort of way of seeing things from the beginning. And then through his career, he found first he had to do the kind of critical mode, and then there was the unfolding of the rest of the sort of vision of things. But obviously one could exaggerate the point, but it does feel like his work was a kind of working out of things he always thought already. Maybe that was just, I don't know, a student's impression, but I have the impression all over again when I reread it. Anyway, it's Williams' underlying conception of mind and world that I wish to focus on for present purposes. This conception is drawn far more directly from Descartes' own thinking, and it's anchored in the idea of the absolute conception of the world, which is one of Williams' most unpopular ideas, among a couple of pretty unpopular ideas. Williams diagnoses Descartes' skeptical interrogation of knowledge as indicating his commitment to a basic idea, namely that if we have knowledge, then it's at some level knowledge of what is there anyway. Knowledge, that is, of something mind-independent, albeit chez Descartes, ultimately guaranteed by a benevolent God. This is represented as implicitly driving Descartes' sense that the category knowledge has an intrinsically problematical character, conducive to skeptical anxiety. Williams describes this anxiety as stemming from a very basic thought that if knowledge is what it claims to be, then it's knowledge of a reality which exists independently of that knowledge. And indeed, except for the special case where the reality known happens itself to be some psychological item, independently of any thought or experience. Knowledge of what is there anyway. One might suppose this thought to be incontestable, but its consequences can seem to be both demanding and puzzling, unquote. Well, demanding and puzzling indeed. In a natural progression of propositions that Williams finds to be recurrent in Western thought, he rehearses the idea that if A and B each have some representation of a patch of the world, where these are both items of knowledge, then there must be some more inclusive representation in which A and B and their different representations both feature, and which explains how these differing items of knowledge are related. Individuals or groups with different color vision would be a case in point, where the more inclusive representation reveals what it is about the different parties' genes, as per the typical case, that explains their cognitive differences in perception. This process can, as he says, be iterated, and the maximally inclusive conception of the world as containing what is there anyway, plus all knowledge representations of it, related coherently to one another, is the absolute conception of the world. As he expressed it, the absolute conception should explain, or at least make it possible to explain, how the more local representations of the world can come about. It's this that would enable us to relate them one to another and to the world as it is, independently of them. To be sure, at this point, Williams is primarily presenting something he finds implicit in Descartes' view rather than expounding his own. On the other hand, it's clear that Williams finds compelling some only slightly slimmed down version of the absolute conception discerned in Descartes' project of radical doubt. Indeed, he says that almost as much is, quotes, involved in the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, unquote, understood so that it's only primary qualities that characterize the material world as it really is. And he adds, I believe that these ideas are not incoherent and have some faith that they're correct, but certainly they involve extensive intellectual commitments not easy to fulfill. Later, in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, which is sort of the middle of his career, 1985, Williams employs his own idea of the absolute conception, one liberated both from Descartes' condition of absolute certainty and also from what Williams dismissed as the positivist fantasy of a cumulative, convergent, self-vindicating, unified science of man and nature. The version of the absolute conception he advanced there, however, is clearly still an evolution of the idea first discerned in the Cartesian engagement with the preconditions of knowing anything. In the ethics and the limits discussion, Williams' purpose was no longer to problematize the concept of knowledge, but rather to emphasize and develop a more general, positive, metaphysical and epistemological picture, which we might cast as a kind of perspectivalism, with apologies for the superimposed ism, which is all mine. At any rate, on this issue, his main purpose by this time was to advance an ethical cognitivism, according to which we can know many perspectival things, for instance, that the grass is green or the action cruel, by employing concepts and aspects of sensibility which are more or less local, more or less perspectival. His strategy is to disaggregate. We should stop talking about knowledge en masse as if it related mind to world in a uniform way, and instead allow that some kinds of knowledge are more perspectival than others. Metaphysically and epistemologically, he effectively posits a continuum rather than a dualism. And he arrives at this continuum of perspectives as a way out of an apparent dilemma, which he formulates as follows. This is number 5 on your handout. On the one hand, the world may be characterized in terms of our current beliefs about what it contains. It is a world of stars, people, grass, or tables. And when the world is taken in this way, our conception of the world as the object of our beliefs can do no better than repeat the beliefs we take to represent it. If, on the other hand, we try to form some idea of a world that's prior to any description of it, the world that all systems of belief and representation are trying to represent, then we have an empty notion of something completely unspecified and unspecifiable. So either way, we fail to have a notion of the world that will do what's required of it. But the dilemma is only apparent, for Williams next offers a third way, as many have tried to do, out of the impasse of choosing either a conception of the world that's a mere function of our beliefs, or, alternatively, a conception of a world whose radical independence renders it wholly unreachable in cognition. Instead, he observes, each side of this dilemma takes all our representations of the world together. But there's a third and more helpful possibility, that we should form a conception of the world that's already there in terms of some, but not all of our beliefs and theories. We can select among our beliefs and features of our world picture some that we can reasonably claim to represent the world in a way to the maximum degree independent of our perspective and its peculiarities. The resultant picture of things, if we can carry through this task, can be called the absolute conception of the world. Now, in this slight switch to what I understand to be a new use for the phrase absolute conception, he moves from the previously maximally inclusive use, a conception that contains all of the features of the world and all our representations of them, coherently related to one another, to an apparently minimalist use, a conception that contains only those features of the world that find representation in our concepts and beliefs that are maximally non-perspectival, non-local, or non-peculiar, to use the other word he often employed in this connection. As I tend to think of it, this more minimal absolute conception will represent only primary qualities, though this is possibly best treated as a rough approximation only, given the complexities of the primary-secondary distinction. At any rate, he seems to be switching to a use of absolute conception as a conception of a substratum of the world that's maximally mind-independent, and to which we become implicitly committed as soon as we entertain the idea of knowledge, no matter how peculiar or local the perspective of that knowledge. For instance, the knowledge that the grass is green, or, moving up the continuum, the knowledge that the action was cruel. The absolute conception, then, is now a conception of a substratum of material features of the world which will feature at the base of any explanation how two different knowledge representations by A and B are both perspectives on the same world. The absolute conception has become a conception of that underlying same maximally mind-independent world. And therefore a conception, as Williams put it, of the world that might be arrived at by any investigators, even if they were very different from us. The main pressure on us all to form the absolute conception is explanatory. We need to explain the differences between different knowledge perspectives as being perspectives on the same thing, the same world. Otherwise, they wouldn't both be knowledge. However, all this being said, Williams' chief point and purpose in this discussion is not, in fact, to affirm our necessary commitment to a shared mind-independent stratum of reality, but rather to indicate and emphasize an exhilarating implication. What's emphatically indicated is that the vast extent of the world that we know is perspectival to a greater or lesser extent. Most of our knowledge is enabled by more or less perspectival concepts and accompanying sensibility, and the features that figure in such knowledge, such as colors or values or social norms and institutions or aspects of personal relationships, definitely do not figure in the absolute conception, though Williams' view is that they must be intelligibly related to it. What Williams was aiming to achieve in this discussion in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy is really two things. He aimed to reject any dualism of fact and value, while conserving and vindicating what he held to be important differences between knowledge delivered by the physical sciences and other kinds of knowledge, such as historical or ethical knowledge. The great asymmetry between scientific knowledge and ethical knowledge is of particular importance to Williams, because the same scientism he found repellent as a matter of philosophical style, where it involved a pretense that philosophy in general, or ought to be, like the empirical sciences, is at work in the idea that the only real knowledge, the only knowledge proper, is knowledge gained of worldly features figuring in the absolute conception. Not so, says Williams. And against this scientism, he aimed to show the science itself is indeed distinctive, difficult, and important, but there are other kinds of knowledge that are also distinctive, difficult, and important for the great expanses of the world, our world, that cannot be known through scientific inquiry. Collapsing the dualism of fact and value in this way, by effectively positing a continuum of increasingly perspectival types of representation of the world, is another way in which I interpret Williams as insisting on a kind of impurity, mingling of elements often kept separate. Whereas positing a binary fact-value dualism insists on black and white, positing a continuum insists on a graduation of subtly changing shades in between. A perspectival representation of the world, whether a color perception or an ethical cognition, involves a cognitive grasp of some feature of the world discerned using a concept and its associated sensibility that's local. It might be species local to most humans, as in the case of color perception, or it might be highly culturally and historically local to some us, where us might indicate a small ethical or political subcommunity within a moral culture. In the particular case of ethical knowledge, Williams offered us an account of how the very concepts in which such items of knowledge were couched were themselves inseparable admixtures of fact and value. Thick ethical concepts, as he called them, are both action-guiding and world-guided, both descriptive and evaluative. Williams expressed agreement with John McDowell, also a very, very rare event between the two of them, with regard to the inseparability of the two aspects. The thought is, one cannot pretend a thick ethical concept is an item of merely descriptive content to which we have added a positive or negative moral valence, as if it were, quotes, guided round the world by its descriptive content, but with a little prescriptive flag attached to it, as William cartooned Hare's prescriptivism. To the contrary, Williams believed that the ability to discriminate situations in which one might properly apply an evaluative concept, such as selfish or vain or generous or churlish, requires already also grasping the evaluative point of the concept in question. This leads us directly to an important stretch of philosophy's border with history. In a case where critical reflection, or indeed any other influence, has alienated us from concepts that were formerly our own in the sense that we live by them and had internalized their action-guiding authority for us, then they cease to be the sort of concept that couches ethical knowledge for us. Instead, according to Williams, the knowledge of how to get around our social world, perhaps, for instance, you have blasphemed or she is not chaste, to use two of his examples, is no longer action-guiding for us. And as Williams theorizes it, therefore no longer ethical knowledge for us. If philosophy seeks to understand our ethical concepts, including their role in motivating action and framing our ethical evaluations, then it had better take a historicized conception of them. As he puts it in Philosophy as a Humanistic Discipline, philosophers cannot altogether ignore history if they're going to understand our ethical concepts at all. One reason for this is that in many cases, the content of our concepts is a contingent historical phenomenon, unquote. In a case where it's indeed reflection that has alienated someone from a concept, for instance, when Oscar Wilde came to the view that blasphemy was not one of his concepts, or when Ibsen's Nora came to the view that wifely obedience was no longer one of hers, then what we're confronted with is the destruction of ethical knowledge by reflection, in Williams' view. Perhaps that's the second least popular idea he ever had. Maybe the absolute conception is like number one. Destruction of ethical knowledge by reflection is probably the second. Maybe it's the other way around. We can have a vote afterwards and see which is the least popular. But I really want to defend the second one anyway. Yes, this is one of his more notorious ideas, but I don't think it should be as problematical as all that, given what he meant by ethical knowledge. And we can, of course, discuss this issue in Q&A. The relevant idea of ethical knowledge is a product of Williams' particular form of moral cognitivism, which is non-objectivist. He argues that we can have ethical knowledge by correctly applying thick ethical concepts whose values we've internalized and live by in practice. If we hadn't internalized them as practical reasons for us, they would trivially have no intrinsic action guiding for us. For Williams, ethical knowledge is knowledge within a moral outlook. With any luck, an outlook that offers us some tools to think critically about what aspects of it we want to retain and which concepts we want to continue to live by. Coming to a sufficiently collective critical attitude towards a thick ethical concept presses that concept out of general service. Elsewhere, I've described the resulting situation as analogous to what happens after a currency, such as pounds, shillings, and pence, alluding to my old country. What happens when that is put out of circulation? One can still count costs using them if one really wants to. We don't suddenly lose the relevant arithmetical competency, but doing so no longer has the same social function or meaning. Functionally speaking, it's just not our money anymore. We can't buy anything with it. The knowledge we once had using such concepts is no longer knowledge of what things cost around here, but only of what they used to cost. Thus, ethical knowledge, whose concepts are pressed out of service by reflection, becomes, I surmise, some other kind of knowledge, presumably historical knowledge. Williams doesn't say. Thus, the destruction of ethical knowledge involves no damage to our grasp of the evaluative point of the now redundant thick ethical concept, but only its action-guiding force. A 19th century woman who grew up instilled with the concept of wifely obedience may rebel against it at some point, but in so rebelling, she loses no conceptual competence and no grasp of evaluative point. Indeed, she may well feel she's only now seeing what its more complex evaluative point really is. What she loses in rejecting the concept, refusing to live by it, and dissociating herself so far as possible from its hold on her, is its action-guiding and wider normative force. On this conception, moments of moral progress will likely involve some destruction of ethical knowledge and its automatic conversion into historical knowledge. Thus, I further surmise, again, Williams doesn't say, there is no net loss of knowledge when we make improvements to our patterns of moral motivation and evaluation, only a conversion of ethical knowledge into historical knowledge. Williams' general conception of thick ethical concepts and what it takes to have competency in using them is one of the areas in his philosophy that has a secret passageway from Wittgenstein. In a footnote in Ethics and the Limits, he observes, the idea that it might be impossible to pick up an evaluative concept unless one shared its evaluative interest is basically a Wittgensteinian idea. In this respect, we see it's Wittgenstein that provided Williams and McDowell with that rare point of convergence. The eschewal of any dualism of fact and value is something Williams admired in Wittgenstein, whom he elsewhere described as producing, and I quote, some of the deepest insights of modern philosophy. It's time to consider Williams' critical engagement with Wittgenstein directly, so that we may not only reflect anew about issues of style, scientism, and the conception of the world, this time through the prism of Wittgenstein's extraordinary philosophical writing, but ultimately also on the broadest question of what, from Williams' point of view, philosophy might become. So, I feel like we're on a long-haul flight. Wiggle your toes, stretch a moment, take a sip of water, and then we'll come back to Wittgenstein. I've called it Wittgenstein and Williams' ambivalence. Earlier, I suggested a number of respects in which we might see Williams as a modernist, including with respect to style in philosophy. In a wonderful essay on the composer Leos Janáček, Williams offered some reflections on the modernist style in music, though swiftly moving to a comparative discussion with philosophy. Here, Williams explores the significance of the ellipses in Janáček's minimalist style of musical composition, making a revealing and somewhat disobliging comparison with Wittgenstein's own disjoined cadences and cumulating motifs. The comparison goes like this, number 7 on your sheet. In some modernist philosophers, there's an analogy to Janáček's ellipses, the elimination of transitions. With them, juxtaposition and repetition provide the structure. But it's not clear how well this can work, indeed, how well it does work, even in the greatest of such philosophers, Wittgenstein. The problem perhaps lies in this, that even if the loss of large-scale development in Janáček is counted as a loss, the result is unquestionably music, and very powerfully so. But philosophy without argumentative development, philosophy in which all the therefores have been replaced by ands or spaces, is dubiously philosophy at all. Or rather, if it is philosophy, as Wittgenstein's quite certainly is, it is so because it's about earlier philosophy, even if it doesn't say so. In this case, the early philosophy was often his own. That other aspect of modernism, historical self-consciousness, has to sustain the identity of the enterprise altogether. So here we glean something of Williams' deep interest in Wittgenstein's philosophy, but his complex attitude toward Wittgenstein. I think we also get some insight into his deeper ambivalence about it. And this ambivalence, I believe, was partly about its gnomic style, but more importantly about two independent concerns: the conception of the world as delivered in Wittgenstein's philosophy of language, and more generally the conception of philosophy as quietist, as an enterprise which, properly understood, leaves everything as it is. So let me first address the ambivalence regarding style. Williams, as I read him, respects Wittgenstein's stylistic modernism and seems even to consider its self-conscious concern with written form as distinctively Wittgensteinian. In What Might Philosophy Become, having just expounded the need for philosophy to seek to ring true to its readers by embracing literary techniques that allow form to contribute to philosophical content, Williams remarks as follows: "The demand on philosophy that it should listen to what it says leads to the concerns of Wittgenstein." Now, Williams doesn't explain, he just doesn't explain at all what he means. So he doesn't explain what he has in mind here in the idea that philosophy should listen to what it says, or really why it leads to Wittgenstein. So here goes. But I interpret him as alluding to Wittgenstein's anti-systematic, fragmented cadences of philosophical prose as an example of a philosopher who does listen to what he says in the sense of deliberately producing a text whose form manifests the content of his philosophical view. In Wittgenstein's writing, one might say the in-between gaps that separate the short aphoristic paragraphs are as integral to the work as the rest in a musical composition. On the other hand, it is with a certain caution that I air this thought, conscious that the explanations of Wittgenstein's fragmentary texts are surely multiple. The Tractatus, comprising a series of short numbered paragraphs ordered, quotes, to indicate the logical importance of the propositions is one thing, but the form and presentation of the posthumously published philosophical investigations quite another, having a more complicated editorial backstory. We should pay attention, for instance, to Wittgenstein's seeming disclaimer in his 1945 preface to the investigations, which reads, number 8 on your handout, "Originally, it was my intention to bring all this together in a book whose form I thought of differently at different times. But it seemed to me essential that in the book the thoughts should proceed from one subject to another in a natural, smooth sequence. After several unsuccessful attempts to weld my results together into such a whole, I realized that I should never succeed. The best that I could write would never be more than philosophical remarks." On the other hand, however, this sentence, which may itself be as much ironical pretext as sincere admission, continues with the thought that the explanation why the task proved impossible was the very nature of its subject matter. Quotes, "My thoughts soon grew feeble if I tried to force them along a single track against their natural inclination. And this was, of course, connected with the very nature of the investigation, for it compels us to travel crisscross in every direction over a wide field of thought." Unquote. Perhaps, then, my suggestion that Williams appreciated in Wittgenstein a remarkable self-conscious harmonization of literary form and philosophical content is sufficiently attuned to the editorial facts, even allowing for the possibility that the gappy modulations of the text may have been partly in spite of, rather than because of, Wittgenstein's avowed best efforts. In addition, I think we have reason to speculate that Williams found in Wittgenstein's fragmentary form an apt implicit entreaty to do what at paragraph 66 of the investigations he famously instructs philosophers to do more generally, namely to look and see what our various different language games are actually like, rather than proceeding on the basis of habitual essentialist assumptions. And this chimes with Williams' own anti-theoretical, anti-systematic stance. though I would also emphasize that in Williams' case, he adopted this stance specifically in ethical and to some extent political philosophy for the reason that these particular areas of philosophy take a highly historically contingent spheres of human life as their subject matter. He did not dogmatically assume that the same anti-theory stance was called for all across the different areas of philosophy. In this particular, one might find Williams to be the more consistent adherent of the injunction to look and see, for he didn't assume that all areas of philosophy called for the same approach. Well, these two moments of harmony being noted, however, it is clear from the slightly unfavorable comparison with Janáček's musical ellipses that Williams found Wittgenstein's style rather too elliptical. And this was not owing to any undiscriminating distaste for the rhythms of aphorism. Williams, after all, relished similar in Nietzsche, but found that Nietzsche successfully, quotes, mined or booby-trapped his works against being assimilated. And when it comes to other Wittgensteinian tropes such as compression and illusion, Williams himself embraced these conceits in his own philosophical writing. They're part of his conversationalism. Rather, what Williams found problematic in Wittgenstein's style, I think, was that in his particular use of these conceits, he left his text so wide open, so minimal in discernible argumentative development, that it was left vulnerable to misappropriation. Not unrelatedly, he also detected a certain self-absorption in Wittgenstein's historical self-consciousness, given that the critical responsiveness seems largely to be in relation to his earlier self. Indeed, Williams described the later work as Wittgenstein talking to himself. Not quite an objection. I'd suggest we hear Williams as offering a mischievously expressed yet genuinely problematizing observation about the distinctive voice of Wittgenstein's work and the unusually self-referential diachronic self-consciousness that it embodied. In this, Williams was not really saying anything that Wittgenstein might not have agreed with, and indeed almost said himself. There is, for instance, that charming moment in the preface to the Tractatus where Wittgenstein writes, "How far my efforts agree with those of other philosophers, I will not decide. Indeed, what I have written here makes no claim to novelty in points of detail, and therefore I give no sources, because it is indifferent to me whether what I have thought has already been thought before me by another." We also know that Wittgenstein thought the vision of the investigations could not come upon one except by seeing it as a rejection of the picture theory he'd presented in the Tractatus, and this was why he wanted to publish them together. Seen from this angle, it's manifestly true of Wittgenstein that he was, in a straightforward, if limited sense, talking to himself. But on the other hand, of course, one can hardly miss Williams' gently lampooning turn of phrase, which was, as ever, a sonorous, proper part of his philosophical point. What are the metaphysical and epistemological differences between the two thinkers, their conceptions of mind and world? Williams was also ambivalent, I think deeply so, about Wittgenstein's philosophy in this regard, and getting clear about why will ultimately lead us to perhaps their greatest disagreement, which concerns the very nature of philosophy and what it can do. But let's start with their conceptions of our cognitive relation to the world. Here, Williams' ambivalence stems significantly from what he considers to be Wittgenstein's stance towards science. On the face of it, there is some harmony between the two thinkers in this regard, since Wittgenstein was vehemently anti-scientism, detesting any effort to assimilate the philosophical enterprise to the scientific one. In this particular, Williams was ready to recognize something of a kindred spirit, and it's principally for this reason that he described Wittgenstein as an anomalous figure in analytic philosophy. On the other hand, and here comes the source of the ambivalence, in Wittgenstein and Idealism, Williams describes Wittgenstein as having, quotes, hatred of the cockiness of natural science, but adds the heavy qualifier that this is, quotes, something which seems to me not easy in his case to distinguish from a hatred of natural science. Williams continues, to adapt a remark of Kreisel's, when the child asks why the people on the other side of the world don't fall off, many will give an explanation in terms of gravity acting towards the center of the earth. But Wittgenstein would draw a circle with a pin man on it, turn it round and say, now we fall into space, unquote. Williams was suspicious then that Wittgenstein's anti-scientism was a veneer that concealed, perhaps even from himself, a metaphysically cheap, anti-scientific attitude. This, as we've already seen, Williams most certainly did not share, not least because it encouraged an a prioristic mindset in analytic philosophy, which surged to banish history from the other direction. In this regard, a priorism, just a habit of mind where you do everything only from the armchair, not looking at history or social world and so on. A priorism was and remains the equal and opposite prejudice to scientism, and both are the enemies of the sorts of humanistic impurity that Williams prized and advocated in philosophy. Williams had no doubt about the importance of science and its genuinely overlapping relation to certain areas of philosophy. His respect for the real challenges of attaining scientific knowledge saw him make a firm but fair distinction between philosophy that honestly engages with relevant scientific research, as opposed to philosophy that merely displays a vain pretension to the manners of science. He quipped, for example, that, quotes, "People perhaps persuade themselves that if they fuss around enough with qualifications and counterexamples, they're conducting the philosophical equivalent of a biochemical protocol," unquote. And his respect for science was also surely a driving force behind this commitment to the absolute conception as populated exclusively by the objects of physical scientific knowledge. For the absolute conception was, I'd emphasize, a conception of something physical, perhaps primary qualities, not metaphysical. And this is one of the respects in which Putnam mischaracterizes the absolute conception in Renewing Philosophy, where he describes Williams as viewing physics as giving the ultimate metaphysical truth, something that Williams explicitly denied. Williams' science-led realist instinct is what drives his critical concern with Wittgenstein's conception of our relationship to the world. In Wittgenstein and Idealism, he argues that Wittgenstein's language-oriented conception is haunted by the spectre of idealism. Wittgenstein's famously declared in Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics, "Not empiricism and yet realism in philosophy. That is the hardest thing." Agreed. And Williams' concern was that the desired realism was not obviously achievable given other of Wittgenstein's commitments. Williams agreed with Peter Hacker that the anti-solipsistic guarantees of the private language argument successfully fend off phenomenalism, and any merely aggregative species of idealism whose conception of the world just adds my language world to yours and yours and yours and so on. Such a view, says Williams, would amount to a non-transcendental or empirical idealism, committed to the incoherent idea that the world is dependent on minds that are themselves part of the empirical world. However, he goes on to argue that there remains a residual worry. Even on the compelling non-private conception of language, we still have a view that seems very close to some other kind of idealism. It's tempting to re-express Williams' concern here in terms of the worry that Wittgenstein's philosophy is unable to sustain something that Williams, after all, believed to be entailed by the very idea that we know anything, namely the absolute conception. But in doing so, I admit, such a rational reconstruction would overreach the textual evidence for the form of his worry, and certainly wouldn't make it any more compelling to those of Wittgensteinian sensibility. Recording the temptation, however, is useful, if only to mark the fact that in Williams' own thought, the absolute conception is the imaginative anchor for his realist commitments as regards our knowledge of the material world, and particularly scientific knowledge, and that it underpins the essential contrast between scientific and ethical knowledge. But be that as it may, the explicit form of Williams' worry concerning the conception of reality available in Wittgenstein's philosophy was that the world came out looking too much like a function of linguistic practice. Specifically, he argued, albeit in a markedly qualified manner, that the later Wittgensteinian idea that the limits of our world are the limits of our language still contained distinct elements of a transcendental idealist position. If there's nothing that could count for us as the world except the world as it's intelligible to us in language, then that at least seems very close to a transcendental idealist position, or maybe indistinguishable from one. Williams summed up his concern as follows. Number 10 on your sheet. The fact that in this way, everything can be expressed only via human interests and concerns, things which are expressions of mind and which themselves cannot ultimately be explained in any further terms, that provides grounds, I suggest, for calling a view a kind of idealism. Not the stupid aggregative kind, he says, but of course the transcendental kind. Another way of bringing out Williams' science-inspired realist inclinations in relation to Wittgenstein's philosophy is to consider that Wittgenstein affects a metaphysical leveling of all domains of knowledge. And that was how it was first explained to me, I remember, by Sabine Lovebond, my teacher. She's talking about what's so exciting about Wittgenstein's philosophy for an ethical realist is that, as it were, everything's on a level, the scientific knowledge and ethical knowledge, and it seems to just clear the pitch for a commonsensical sounding ethical realism. I don't think Williams didn't find it so commonsensical. If all regions of knowledge are equally to be understood in relation to the contours of our language games, then there are no significant asymmetries when it comes to their metaphysical status. This leveling, impressively built upon by Wittgensteinian ethical realists, who effectively consider it a leveling up for ethics, is precisely what Williams believed we needed to resist in order to make sense of the mind independence of the basic physical features of the world, and indeed to locate the contrast with the historical contingency of ethical thought. This concern finds a more straightforwardly normative expression in his paper, Pluralism, Community, and Left Wittgensteinianism. He says this, it's number 11. On the Wittgensteinian picture, whether in mathematics, in our ordinary language, or in ethics, everything equally is a matter of practice, of what we find natural. It's mistaken on this picture to try to ground our practices, whether ethical or cognitive. We must rather recognize that our way of going on is simply our way of going on, and that we must live within it rather than try to justify it. But Williams took this form of the thought to be unsustainable, because in the modern era, the domain of the ethical and political is characterized by an array of alternative actual and possible ways of going on, so that the injunction to keep going on is hopelessly underdeterminative. And this normative point finds expression once again in relation to the Wittgensteinian insistence on the universal use of we and our. Williams says, when Wittgensteinians speak of our form of life, they characteristically use that expression in what linguistics calls an inclusive rather than a contrastive way. The we represents not us against others, but an us that embraces anybody with whom we could intelligibly hold a conversation. It's obvious why this should be appropriate to matters of meaning and understanding, and why also it's plausible to say in those connections that we have no way of standing outside us. But we cannot simply take this idea over into ethical and social thought. Here, Williams is talking about Wittgensteinians rather than Wittgenstein himself. But in this particular, I think it makes little difference. The metaphysical leveling affected by Wittgenstein's philosophy of language is found problematic by Williams on at least two scores. It sells short the objective reality of the physical world, thus by implication also underselling the difficulties of science, and it trades in an insufficiently historically and socially realistic conception of the ethical, gliding over the potentially intractable difficulties and lacunae in determining how to go on in the midst of conflicting value commitments. We saw in Williams' discussion of the absolute conception that he took us to be confronted with an apparent dilemma concerning the idea of a mind-independent reality, an all-or-nothing dilemma we could, however, escape by embracing his perspectivalist third way. He said there that, as I put it, we need to disaggregate our representations of the world and see that some, but only some of them, are the minimally perspectival representations of features of the absolute conception. For Williams, there's plenty of our world, perspectival and local, round and about us, knowledge of which is in some degree perspectival. But given we know anything at all, this must be intelligibly related sub substratum, which is there for any knower, there anyway. That's what we see differently. That's what we disagree about. This metaphysical picture is obviously quite anathema to the level Wittgensteinian landscape, where the two regions of thought are on a par. The issue reveals a fundamental metaphysical difference between the two thinkers, and one that is moreover expressive of two utterly different philosophical temperaments. Williams' asymmetrical commitment on the one hand to a science-oriented realism about the physical world of which we are a part, and on the other to a historicist social constructionism concerning the ethical, is the heart of the second respect in which I'm suggesting we should see him as deeply ambivalent about Wittgenstein's philosophy. The third and final feature of Wittgenstein's thought that I wish to address from Williams' point of view concerns the idea that sometimes our processes of reasoning and justification run out, so that we come to a point where we can but affirm that our spade is turned, this is simply what I do. With this thought, Williams regards Wittgenstein as having offered us one of the greatest insights of modern analytic philosophy. That was it. That was what he was referring to. And however, once again, the universal application of the idea meant that Williams was not in any straightforward agreement. He thoroughly agreed with this application in value contexts, where he felt we urgently still needed some way, some philosophical, as it were, articulation that would help us make sense of the fact that some values are for us unhintergehbar, as he called it, can't get beyondable. He used the German word as a label to crystallize the ethical psychological impossibility of renouncing certain of our most deeply held values. Take the fundamental ethical idea that all human life has equal moral worth. For such a conviction, philosophy needs to be able to articulate, for some us, the idea that for us, it's simply there. And the Wittgensteinian insistence that the reasons and justifications for such commitments inevitably soon run out so that we arrive at bedrock is, he thought, a game-changing philosophical advance. Williams not only agrees with it and considers it a great insight, he also explains how this very fact that we arrive at justificatory bedrock in such matters is part of what makes a historical perspective in philosophy so valuable, since we need it to help us understand which values have this special status for us and why this might have come about. He says, for instance, in Philosophy as a Humanistic Discipline, quote 13 on the handout, above all, historical understanding can help with the business of distinguishing between different ways in which various of our ideas and procedures can seem to be such that we cannot get beyond them, that there is no conceivable alternative. And this brings us back to Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein influentially and correctly insisted that there was an end to justifications, that at various points we run into the fact that this is the way we go on. Once again, however, Williams would not have agreed with the blanket application of this idea, and in particular, he explicitly disagreed with the implication that since all our ways of going on are as they are, there's no significant normative or explanatory job left for philosophy to do. On the contrary, he asserted that, quotes, even with regard to those elements of our outlook for which there are no further justifications, there can still be explanations which help to locate them in relation to their rivals, and he thought philosophy can do that job. Philosophy need not and should not fall quiet, leaving everything as it is, even in those cases where we've run out of justifications for the proposition, for instance, that all human lives possess equal moral worth. For there is other work to be done besides tracing direct lines of justification. There is, for instance, critical work to be done in relation, as he puts it, to comparing our ethical ideas with their rivals, or refining exactly what it is that we find unhintergehbar. Moreover, this historicism insists even, that what is unhintergehbar for a given us in a moral culture can change over time. The associated Wittgensteinian idea that there are no genuine deep philosophical problems, but only problems conjured into existence by philosophy itself, is also an element that Williams found problematic because overgeneralized. He wasn't averse to drawing this verdict in particular cases. He himself argued, for instance, that the problem of free will was exactly like this. In Shame and Necessity, he effectively advocated quietism on the free will issue, though sourcing the relevant attitude in Nietzsche rather than in Wittgenstein, and praising the Greeks for having the right idea. The traditional, this is his quote 14 for you, the traditional metaphysical problem of the freedom of the will exists only for those who have metaphysical expectations, just as there is a problem of evil only for those who expect the world to be good. There's a problem of free will only for those who think that the notion of the voluntary can be metaphysically deepened. In truth, though it may be extended or contracted in various ways, it can hardly be deepened at all. What threatens is the attempt to make it profound, and the effect of trying to deepen it is to put it beyond all recognition. The Greeks were not involved in those attempts, and this is one of the places in which we encounter their gift for being superficial out of profundity. But the point is that free will was for Williams a special case, indeed an exception proving the rule. As ever, he resisted the universal proceeding in a more piecemeal fashion, insisting, in his own terms, on looking and seeing. Wittgenstein, of course, had his own distinctive reasons for coming to his quietist conception of philosophy, and they were undoubtedly general in nature. But Williams believed that Wittgenstein's dramatically chastened conception of what philosophy can do for us stems significantly from the idea, the false idea, that it's an essentially and radically peculiar intellectual activity. Worse, this essentializing conception of philosophy as radically peculiar is possessive and unfortunately self-fulfilling power. Williams puts it like this: some of the deepest insights of modern philosophy, notably in the work of Wittgenstein, remain undeveloped. Indeed, at the limit, they're rendered unintelligible, precisely because of an assumption that philosophy is something quite peculiar, which should not be confused with any other kind of study and which needs no other kind of study in order to understand itself. Wittgenstein, in his later work, influentially rejected essentialism and spoke of family resemblances and so on. But at the same time, he was obsessed, I do not think it too strong a word, by the identity of philosophy as an enterprise which was utterly peculiar compared with other enterprises, unquote. By contrast, When it came to the nature of philosophy and its relation to other forms of inquiry or intellectual activity, Williams was basically on Descartes' side. Unlike Wittgenstein, Descartes saw philosophy as continuous with other forms of inquiry, both science and, of course, history. In the Descartes book, just after recounting Descartes' comment to Princess Elizabeth that philosophical inquiry should be undertaken at most only once in a lifetime and by most not at all, Williams explains, "This is not at all because Descartes holds, as some modern views hold, that philosophy has a quite special subject matter or is in some other way quite discontinuous from the sciences. On the contrary, he thinks, rightly, that philosophy and the sciences are continuous with one another, and he expresses one version of that idea in his image of the tree of knowledge, of which the roots are metaphysics, the trunk physics, and the branches the other sciences." So, let me wrap up. Thank you for your patience. A little bit of conclusion. Williams believed in philosophy's obligations to science for all the reasons we've been discussing. But above all, he advocated that philosophy needed history. This is the chief impurity that our inquiries need in order to make sense of our world as it's come down to us, including the modes of understanding it that we have inherited into the bargain. He believed that history can assist philosophy by preventing us from reinventing the wheel, or indeed, alluding to a warning from Santayana, the square wheel. But Williams was equally aware, of course, that history can undermine our philosophical efforts by discrediting the conceptions that they employ. In this connection, he most often mentioned Rorty, because Rorty so vehemently and explicitly argued against the so-called epistemological conception of philosophy as a mirror of nature, which he rejected wholesale, presuming it essential to the enterprise, in itself a surprisingly ahistorical presumption for someone with Rorty's contingentist commitments. Rorty's own alternative conception of philosophy, or at least of ethical and political thought, was that height of unresolved metaphysical disillusion, liberal Ironism. And this conception required the philosopher to be possessed of dual personae, operating out there, wherever that is, in reality, with some ethical convictions as a public liberal, yet inhabiting the stance of private skeptic when in the study. But Rorty aside, the point I really want to make is that Williams might just as naturally in this connection have referred to Wittgenstein's equally disillusioned conception of philosophy as turning out to lack any genuine puzzles to solve, learning to see itself as a match only for puzzles of its own fantasized creation, so that on this reckoning, the best place we can find for the philosophy of value is, if not shut in the study, exchanging urbane, self-undermining reflections with the skeptical ironist, perhaps that in the corner, face to the wall, permanently quiet. And Williams found that both Rorty's and Wittgenstein's conceptions of what philosophy should become were catastrophically misguided. I found myself wanting to characterize each of them as an anti-philosophical counsel of despair after disillusionment with philosophy that would never have happened were it not for embracing unworldly ambitions for it in the first place. As ever, the way to avoid disillusionment is to start out with a more realistically conceived idea of how philosophy is related to other forms of inquiry, most particularly for Williams, science and history. Both scientism and a priorism squeeze out historical self-consciousness, and so squeeze out the prospect of philosophy being able to really help us make sense of our present practices in the light of the past. And that's not something we can do in science. And as Williams repeatedly emphasized, it's not something we can do exclusively a priori either. So let me end with Williams' own way of stating the present challenge for philosophy in its self-conception as a humanistic discipline. For it seems to me that over 20 years after he wrote these words, and even while the pressures on the humanities in the UK and the US are notably different from one another, still his words deliver a prescient warning concerning current threats to what he called the passionate, intelligent activity of trying to understand ourselves. And so the last word is for Williams. We run the risk that the whole humanistic enterprise of trying to understand ourselves is coming to seem peculiar. For various reasons, education is being driven towards an increasing concentration on the technical and the commercial, to a point at which any more reflective inquiry may come to seem unnecessary and archaic, something that at best is preserved as part of the heritage industry. If that is how it's preserved, it will not be the passionate and intelligent activity that it needs to be. Thank you.
we'll just have questions. We won't have many follow-ups.
Everybody.
Okay, stop. If you can hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice.
You don't have to use a microphone. Use it.
Good point.
The microphone is for the questions. So if you want to ask a question, please give me a second so I can give you the microphone. And if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. I'll try my best to start the queue. If there are graduate students, I will start with them, and otherwise, please take it away. Oh, sorry.
No, you took it away.
Hi, thank you for a lovely lecture. My question is about your, if you want to call it that, rational reconstruction of Williams on thick ethical concepts and the idea of passing from ethical knowledge to historical knowledge. And I have maybe it's an Occamian kind of concern about that, but what the real concern is that it prevents us from understanding our own historical moment. So if you think about a concept like slavery, in this country, it had a positive valence for many people. It had a negative valence for other people. And you might say that it had a whole legal, infrastructure going with it. Now, we might say, well, it has passed into historical knowledge because it no longer has that positive valence. But for some people, it probably never lost that positive valence. The same is true of Nazism, right? So there are neo-Nazis. Ron DeSantis in Florida has recently been arguing slavery wasn't so bad, actually, right? So if we have your account of Williams' account, then do we have to say that slavery used to be ethical knowledge, but then it passed into historical knowledge? But then what are we to say now? That some people are trying to bring it back into ethical knowledge? I mean, and wouldn't a simpler way for us to understand it be, you can describe it, you can give a description of it, and then you can have a positive or negative valence to it, and that's always the case. And, there would be an analogy there to law, right? So we can answer questions about what would have been legal under the Fugitive Slave Act. We can answer questions about what would have been, property ownership in Nazi Germany without endorsing it, but we can say, descriptively, this is what the law would be. So wouldn't that be a cleaner, not just Occamian, but a better way to understand what's going on in some of the most contentious parts of our own historical moment?
Thanks. Yes. And I think, good. I think I'm booming. I'm not booming too much, I hope. I just switched this mic on. Yes. So Williams' thesis is only about thick ethical concepts. So virtue and vice concepts. So evaluative concepts, not nouns. So, I don't think he would think this idea, we don't, I wonder what he just said about an example that's the name of an institution like slavery, which, as you said, can actually kind of have a positive or a negative valence depending on whether people approve or disapprove of it. Hard to believe that's possible. But anyway, historically, all sorts of things are possible. Just to be clear, thick ethical concepts are a curious sort of concept and a curious sort of word because they have both descriptive and evaluative aspects. And he just never said what he would say about other sorts of concepts, which might, by extension, also look kind of thick in this way. I think he would have resisted the idea that because we can have positive or negative, approving or disapproving attitudes to all sorts of things in the world, that makes all the concepts thick. So I suspect he would have just wanted to say, you're right, say that about slavery and all sorts of other things, which we still have these concepts to refer to these historical entities. My thesis is only about how we carve up our evaluative world. Now, there could be some thick ethical concepts which were pretty relevant to institutions like slavery. I can only think of one which is more pertinent to a kind of class system. The adjective impertinent, for instance. I remember growing up, it was used a bit between, as it were, elders and youngers, but in general, impertinent is like a British class system thing that upper class people would describe a working class person as being impertinent by calling them by their first name or something. And I think that being an example of clearly a thick ethical concept, it's evaluating someone's behavior. Yeah, well, I mean, that's also a noun. I don't know. We clearly drive that out. I don't know whether he would want to say we would ever have had ethical knowledge using that concept, though. It's an interesting question. I don't know what he'd have. I mean,
It seems kind of gerrymandered.
Yeah. So he was thinking about the ethical knowledge we have in applying the thick ethical concept. So at a time, in a rigid class system, there could have been ethical knowledge that, yes, I was impertinent in talking to her that way, even though it makes me sick that we use this notion of impertinence, and the whole way of constructing my behavior in that mode is something I want rid of. And yet, it's true, I was impertinent. But the more critical I am of it, we start wanting to put inverted commas and we back away. And if everyone agrees enough, we stop using the word and it becomes like calling Elizabeth I chaste or something. So I hope I'm not just sort of sidestepping the question. I mean, his view was very much, this is a view about thick ethical concepts, and slur terms and noun phrases didn't come into that category. So I don't know what he said about them, but I suspect he would say we don't have ethical knowledge in interpreting the world in the light of that concept. But yeah, I hope that's a beginning of an answer anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I had a question about the absolute conception in connection with transcendental idealism. So sorry, I'll try and be quick. Sounds
like a really quick question.
Yeah, but as I understood what you were saying about Wittgenstein and idealism, Williams was sort of hostile to the transcendental idealist tendency of that because roughly, I mean, for one reason anyway, being that he thought it imperiled the absolute conception.
I was suggesting that, yeah. I don't know if Williams,
okay.
Doing Williams' exegesis, I can just imagine him rolling his eyes up there, thinking, sorry, I hope. But anyway, he had this realist commitment, which at one point was expressed in terms of the absolute conception. He did continue to be committed to the absolute conception, even though nobody else liked it.
Right.
And for that way, I think it infuses his general distaste for philosophy, which he thought had trouble incorporating the important differences in science,
right.
which is, at least physical science is certainly about the absolute conception, and
right.
all the other kind of knowledge that we've got, which is just different in structure.
Well, my question was really about the degree to which this idea of what's there anyway might be what's really important in objectivity, as he seemed to think. So, I mean, if Kant was right, then what physicists are seeking to describe isn't really what's there anyway, right? Because it's only there as apprehended by creatures with a sensible intuition and, imposed space and time and all the rest of it. But even if Kant were right, it still seems like the idea of what physicists seek to describe is going to be able to sort of do the job of a kind of emblem of robust objectivity for Williams. Even though in this respect it no longer counts as what's there anyway. So my thought was this might indicate that the idea of what's there anyway might not, after all, be what's really important with regard to having a kind of touchstone for objectivity for ourselves.
Right. Are you thinking that Williams...
Why isn't that objectivity enough, in other words?
For Williams.
For Williams, yeah.
Well, one thing, the kind of idealism he was worried that Wittgenstein's philosophy led to didn't seem to be a kind of idealism that had any commitments to the noumenal realm or anything. So it wasn't a sort of Kantian type of idealism. So he just didn't really address that. He was worried that for all Wittgenstein gives us, the world comes out looking too much like a function of language. And so it's just kind of, I don't know, idealism, really just not what he called the stupid kind of idealism, which is incoherent in various ways because it's just an aggregate of my language world plus your language world plus their language world.
Right.
But let's see, I am confident that he would have wanted to reject that, the idea that there's a noumenal realm helped kind of ground any everyday realist sense of what we know. And it was very much a kind of commonsensical realism, that what he wanted. And he just kind of saw that was in tune with what science thinks of itself as doing. And he wanted philosophy to vindicate that. So I suspect he would have, it's a very interesting question, exactly what in the idea of something's being there anyway is sort of supposed to do, what sort of confidence that's supposed to bring. And so you could think, well, hey, you've got the noumena. We know they're there. We don't know anything about them. Never mind, as long as it's there, we're good. He wouldn't have found that a comforting, everyday, commonsensical realist thought by any means. So I think the kind of idealism he was worried was looming around Wittgenstein was of a different kind. It was kind of simple world as a function of language.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks for that. I'm wondering whether, it was very nice to hear that Williams was a defender of the possibility of feminist philosophy. And I'm wondering whether one particular piece of it is something that he would have, or more interestingly, I suppose you would, find useful. And that's Sandra Harding's notion of strong objectivity, putting the subject in the same the subject of knowledge in the same causal plane as the object of knowledge that is equally real, and stopping idealizing knowing subjects and taking perspectivalism to be a necessary consequence of realism. That is one way to distinguish between a hallucination of a hippopotamus and a real hippopotamus, is that the real hippopotamus is going to look different to people differently located with respect to it. So it's a mark of the real that people's ideas about it, perceptions of it, are perspectival. And if one takes that approach, then it seems to me the move towards something like an absolute conception is not toward any kind of aperspectivalism, but an explanation of the different perspectives, and that carries over to the ethical realm, that is coming to an understanding of why those people believe things that seem to us preposterous or heinous. And sort of putting, in a way, it's a kind of flattening, but it's a move toward across-the-board realism that doesn't separate the knower from the known world, and that treats the world as real precisely through acknowledging how and why it is that perspectives on it differ.
Thank you. Such a great connection with Harding's idea of strong objectivity. I think basically everything you just said, I hear as a really interesting way of fleshing out things that Williams agreed with when he used the notion of the absolute conception in the maximalist way as all our perspectives on things, plus an enlarged perspective whereby we can understand why we view things differently, so that the knowers, the viewers, are in the frame. And that was kind of the inclusive perspective. So in the simple illustration is, I have color blindness and you don't. I reverse red and green. Someone can say, why is that? Naomi, Miranda, here's a whole explanation because they have slightly different this and the genetic thing. And that's strong objectivity in a certain way. And for Williams, he said, that's what we want. That's what we want to understand. But he added, he thought that the limiting case of it was that he thought it implied, in a way, taking the notion of a perspective on what? Seriously, that there was something shared, a stratum of primary qualities and so on, at the base of it all, by reference to which we are all, with our more perspectival ways of knowing, picking up on features. I'll pick up on features that this person doesn't pick up on because, they're a bat and I'm human or something like this. And so he thought that the minimalism and the maximalism were, as it were, each necessitated the other. So, there's a sense in which one could recast him insofar as he certainly wanted to affirm, most of what we know is perspectival. Great, that's the world we know and love. And even before you get anywhere near art and history and philosophy, you've got color. This is our world. We have knowledge of it. And he wanted to affirm, sure, the reality of that. But he didn't really use that word very often to be, say, a realist about those things, because it might have obscured what he thought was going on at the other end of the continuum, which was that there are certain features of the world which we're committed to, if we know anything, and which are maximally aperspectival. And the best candidates for them is something like what physics tries to capture in quarks and quasars and so on. So I think he could sort of agree. It almost becomes a terminological difference, perhaps apart from the insistence on the minimal. I'm not sure. Thank you.
I'd like to hear a bit more about a comment on free will, because it seems to me more problematic than it looks. First of all, if you get to just sweep free will out of the picture, can't you do that all the time? And if you don't, you just get Wittgenstein back, it's all flattened again? And if not, how do you tell when you say, well, this is just aspiring to metaphysics when you can't get it, and when, no, you really need to do some deepening?
Yeah. I mean, whether you think that will depend on whether you're impressed by the particular reasons Williams had. So you're right, one would need to hear more. I mean, in a way, all of Shame and Necessity was about trying to say, look, the basic ingredients of ethical responsibility in most of our ethical life involve agents doing things voluntarily, not coerced, might be coerced, but if they do it voluntarily, then they're responsible. You need these fairly simple everyday items, he insisted, to get the whole thing going. What he thought we don't need is to keep pressing the question in ways that a Wittgensteinian will tell us, no, you'll obscure things if you keep saying, but why, and dig inappropriately deep and make a false puzzle. And he argued that, the free will debate got into trouble and got into completely intractable territory because it allowed a kind of attempt at deepening something that should remain on the surface, and these differences between what's voluntary, what's coerced, whether you have an intention, and so on. So I'm not saying everyone will be impressed by that argument, but he thought he had to make a particular argument for it. And that's really how I understand an awful lot of the material of Shame and Necessity, looking at these basic, because he thought that the ancient Greeks didn't, as it were, weren't troubled in the way we moderns are with these questions of, but how can it be really on me if I didn't control it, and if I didn't control my character that led me to do the thing, and so on. The Greeks just didn't ask those questions. Should they have? I don't think so, because they seem to have enough to have an account of action and responsibility. So that was, I'm as it were, paraphrasing him. So he's saying you can have a form of life where you've got all the ingredients, that's all you need. We really shouldn't go looking for trouble where there is none. That was but I'm sure not everyone will be convinced.
My worry is when he goes on to say, well, there wouldn't be a problem of evil unless you expected the world to be good. What if I had no expectations either way, and there's a problem of evil and a problem of good, and they mirror each other, but I'm surprised there's either evil or good in the world? It seems to me that's a totally reasonable thing to at least start out with. And I don't know if it's deepening the problem or just spreading the problem, but it's not dismissing the problem.
Yes, I mean, did he dismiss the problem? I mean, he wasn't a theist, so he didn't have a problem with evil, but I mean, he wouldn't be dismissive of it, but he would argue that the problem arises because of a premise. Do we have to accept the premise? That's a good question. And he thought the same with free will. So we'll get into these problems if we don't accept that the more superficial language we've already got is enough to explain the phenomenon of responsible action and holding each other responsible in the ordinary manner. And I don't think he wanted to say, there will be no discussions of free will in this university anymore. But his contribution to that discussion was, I really think we should change the subject, people, because we're going down a rabbit hole here. Yeah.
So Laura.
Hi, thank you for the talk, first of all. I had a question about quote number 3 on your handouts, the one about the truth about the past.
Right.
So, when Williams says there are many truths about the past, but there is no such thing as the truth, so therefore, we don't want history to tell us, we don't want our interpretations of the past to tell us something called the truth about the past. As I understood your interpretation, you took Williams to mean that there was a place for, what you called constrained creative license. But it seemed to me at least that what this was trying to, or what Williams might have been trying to say was something more akin to the idea that, there might be ways of describing the past which are, not necessarily metaphorical or fictional or using any of these other devices, but which are truth acts, and yet, due to other reasons, not necessarily capable of being unified into one continuous narrative or one unique narrative, which could be called the truth about the past. In other words, there are many ways of approaching the past which are both truth, which are equally truth acts. And so the question is not whether there's a role for fiction or metaphor and so on, but whether there's a role for different ways of describing the past, which cannot necessarily be paired off against each other and compared as to their truth or falsity. But
I could say that very last sentence. I just couldn't hear the ways which couldn't be compared.
Which cannot necessarily be compared in such a sense that only one of them can be true at once.
Right.
But
yes,
So I guess my question is, I wanted to understand why you were focusing more on ways of representing the past, which are not necessarily truth acts as such.
So the truth, his distinction. So the idea of truth aptitude, let's leave that to one side. You're capable of being true or false. He thinks that when you do history, you are, of course, committed to the idea that there's some chronicle of, so let's say, a domain of things which are truth apt, right? So that you could be true or false. And then you want the true one, so you want a sequence of events that all did happen. So when you say this happened and there was a battle and they're all true. That's the role, that's as far as kind of the role for truth goes. And then he's suggesting the rest, and this is, this is in a way standard. Unless one is a positivist about history, this is kind of fairly normal take on history. After that, you're in the domain of interpretation, and there can be better and worse interpretations in various ways. But even if we can find all the interpretations so that there's no errors, so all the truths are in order, in the correct order, and so on, there could be more or less illuminating ways of telling the story, foregrounding and backgrounding. And that's where he doesn't quite talk this way, but I think he'd be fine with saying there's more or less truthful. You can have this history, this doesn't say anything false, but it's not as truthful as this history, because that really brings out what were the main causal drivers of the revolution or whatever it might be. So truthfulness pertains to interpretations, and truth is just, as it were, whether you've got your facts straight. And his sort of other claim in terms of what makes for a good interpretation, what makes for a truthful interpretation, was specifically how far a piece of history can help make sense of those past events to us in the now. How much do they help us understand ourselves in the light of the past? That's a desideratum of historical interpretation, which I think he wouldn't have mind saying could make one more truthful than the next. He didn't quite talk this way, but basically truthfulness pertains to interpretations. And we want quite a lot of different things from interpretations at different times. But the one that he specifically mentioned was this idea of making sense. He was always talking about making sense. One of his collections was called Making Sense of Humanity. Making sense of ourselves in the light of the past is something he thought we should do in philosophy as well as in history generally. So he confined the notion of
truth to sort of fairly ordinary factive matters. And you definitely need to get that right if you're doing history. You don't want to be peddling falsehoods. But after that, doing history well is this interpretive exercise, which he talked of in terms of truthfulness. So does that get to what you were? Have I answered your question? Yeah, great. Thank you.
Well, actually, this is a good moment for us to move to. So thank you. Let me thank the speaker. Please join me.
Thank you. Thank you.